Welcome to Cople Parish in historic Westmoreland County, Virginia, on the anniversary of its 350th year. The parish is made up of three churches: Ecomico, near Turkey Hill, St. James Tidwell's, and Nominee Church, located in the Mount Holly area. The celebration began in February 2014 with a four-part lecture series on the colonial church presented by the noted historian, the Reverend Dr. Christopher Agnew.
The church in Virginia had changed.
In May, the presiding bishop and primate of the Episcopal Church, the Most Reverend Dr. Catherine Jeffords Shorey, and the Bishop of the Diocese of Virginia, the Right Reverend Shannon Sherwood Johnston, officiated at a service held in one of the three parish churches, Ecomico Church, on the exact day of the establishment of Cople Parish 350 years ago. How was this parish established so long ago? One of the parish's most respected members, Tayloe Murphy, explains.
Nicholas Spencer came to Virginia from England sometime in the 1650s, and he settled in Westmoreland County, and he is known as Nicholas Spencer of Nominee. He spelled it Nominy, but he is Nicholas Spencer of Nominee in Westmoreland County. He came to Virginia. He settled in Westmoreland County. He married a woman by the name of Frances Mottram. Now, she was the sister of Anne Mottram, both of whom were daughters of Captain John Mottram, who is thought to be the first actual English settler in the Northern Neck. Okay. He came to the Northern Neck apparently sometime around 1642 and lived at what we now call Cone Hall or Chickacone down in Northumberland County on the Cone River. Nicholas Spencer was an aristocrat, maybe the first real aristocrat that came to Virginia in those days. They were from Bedfordshire, and he was a cousin of Lord Culpeper. And Lord Culpeper was one of the noblemen who had obtained the Northern Neck Proprietary in 1649 from King Charles II, who was then in exile in France, and he had given 7 of his loyal lords this proprietary interest in what was then called the Northern Neck. And apparently, Nicholas Spencer came to Virginia to look after his cousin's interests in the Northern Neck that he had been given by the king. And then ultimately, I'm not sure the date, but ultimately Culpeper acquired all of the interests in the Northern Neck Proprietary, perhaps with one exception, but I think he largely acquired the entire thing. And then he married, his daughter, Catherine, married Lord Fairfax, and she inherited this proprietary, and it became known as the Fairfax Proprietary. Most people don't think of the Northern Neck as Culpeper, but that's really where it started, with Lord Culpeper. But anyway, Nicholas Spencer was Lord Culpeper's cousin, and he came to Virginia to look after his interests. And when Lord Culpeper left, for a short time, Nicholas Spencer served as governor of the colony until Howard Lord Effingham, I think, came to replace Culpeper as the royal governor. But in any event, in 1688, Nicholas Spencer wrote his will, and I have that here, and I think it's rather interesting. I have an excerpt from it, and if you would like, will read. It says, and this is printed from a document published in England called American Wills Proved in London, and it says, Nicholas Spencer of Nominee, Westmoreland County, Virginia, dated 25 April 1688. I am now the only surviving son of my late father, Nicholas Spencer, Esquire, and heir to my late brother, William Spencer, Esquire, and I leave to my son, William Spencer, now in England, all my lands and tenements in England, in Cople, Bedfordshire, Barford, Blenheim, and St. Neots, N-E-O-T-S, Neots.
Yep.
Hunts, I guess that's H-U-N-T-S period, that's Huntingdon. And Cottam Hall in Essex. To my wife Frances, during her life, my lands and tenements in the neck of land called King Copsco, which I bought of Mr. Richard Wright, Mr. James Hardage, and Richard Oburn, and which were formerly William Newberry's, with remainder to my son Mottram Spencer. To my son Nicholas Spencer, all my lands at the head of Nominee I bought of Mr. Foster, Mr. Hawkins, and Mr. Manley. To my son John Spencer, I give the title of land near Pope's Creek and lands I bought of Mr. William Horton, Captain John Lloyd, Jacob Rennie, and Mr. John Frodstrom, the last line near Colonel William Pierce's land and dwelling seat. To my son Francis Spencer, my moiety of 5,000 acres, which will fall to me and Captain Lawrence Washington as joint tenants. To my son Mottram Spencer, 500 pounds sterling out of my lands in England when he is 21. My son William Spencer to be executor for England, and my wife and sons Nicholas and John Spencer for Virginia. My friends Colonel Isaac Allerton and Captain Lawrence Washington to be overseers. My debts are to be paid in money and not in commodities, according to that unequal and dishonorable law of Virginia. And then he has witnesses, George Luke, Thomas Hobson, and Nathaniel Webster. And he signed it, and apparently it was probated sometime before 1700 in London, but it must also be probated in Westmoreland County, although I've never checked the records in Westmoreland to see if this will is also recorded in Montrose. It probably is. Yeah. But in any event, he had acquired a lot of land in Westmoreland County, and with one of the Washingtons, he had also acquired what is now the Mount Vernon plantation. And he mentions, I think, in this will that to his son Francis, the moiety of 5,000 acres, which fell to me and Captain Lawrence Washington as joint tenants. I think that's Mount Vernon. But in any event, there's also some records, again, not verified by me, that in the early 18th century, Spencer owned over 6,000 acres in Westmoreland County, which he sold to the Carter family. And ultimately, a portion of that property became known as Nominee Hall, and it's where Robert Carter II built his house that was subsequently occupied by his son Robert Carter III, which was the location for Philip Fithian's diary.
What is the relationship between John Washington and Lawrence Washington? And presumably John Washington was, to Nicholas Spencer, must have been a British friend. Was John Washington a British friend of Nicholas Spencer?
Apparently the Washington family had been friends of the Spencer family in England.
Oh, okay.
And it was somewhere I've read that Nicholas Spencer's family were also, they were relatives of the Spencers of Northamptonshire. And somewhere along the line, I think that line of the Spencer family is Princess Diana's family.
Yes.
And I know that I've seen a documentary that links the Washingtons to the Spencers, where Princess Diana's brother still lives, I think.
Yeah.
And I can't remember the name of the place.
Okay.
But there's some connection between the Washingtons and the Spencers. There was in England. But there was also the connection here between Nicholas Spencer and some of the Washingtons.
So why would he have been recognized for Cople Parish? Purely his birthright in England as an aristocrat, or what did he do here in Virginia for Westmoreland? Westmoreland County must have established Cople Parish, yes?
John Mottram, whom I mentioned earlier, was living in Northumberland County, but when he emigrated and established his seat in Northumberland County, Westmoreland was part of Northumberland.
Okay.
It was not until 1653 that Westmoreland was separated into a separate county from Northumberland. And at that time, the dividing line was Lower Machota Creek. They went right just east of here. Mm-hmm. And the changes that took place in the county line, I think, were done contemporaneously with the establishment of Cople Parish, which would have been around 1664. In that period, I think the boundary line of Westmoreland was moved eastward to the Yokomoka River, so that now the boundary line between Westmoreland and Northumberland is the Yokomoka River. And I think it was at that point in time where Cople Parish was created as a separate parish, because prior to that time wasn't it Chickacoon, and which was a Northumberland County name. Mm-hmm. So, and even though that the church was built in 1655, that would have been 2 years after the creation of the county. The church had not changed its boundaries, the parish boundaries, apparently.
Yeah.
The parish boundaries were adjusted in 1664 to create Cople Parish, but at that time, Nicholas Spencer was living here.
Yeah.
And was active, and he was in the House of Burgesses. He was a very influential member of the community.
So basically he was recognised for his contribution to the community by having the parish named after his
He was probably the leading citizen.
Okay.
He was probably the leading citizen of the county at that time. He certainly brought with him the credentials being related to the Culpepers, okay, and having his status and his family's status in England probably gave him an even, gave it probably a status here that was greater than some of his contemporaries who lived at the same time, because he was really early.
Yeah, and he was young.
He was young, and he married, but he married locally. And I don't know what happened. I don't know anybody who is descended from him. I do these children that he has, these sons. I don't know. I know I'm a descendant of Richard Wright, mm-hmm, through my mother,
who came before Nicholas Spencer.
Yes, Richard Wright was here early, before Spencer. And he was the son-in-law of Mottram, John Mottram. And so when Nicholas Spencer married his sister-in-law, that's when they became tied together in family relationships. But my great-grandmother was named Olivia Jane Wright. She married a Braxton, and through her, I'm descended from Richard Wright, who was who lived somewhere in this area between Nominee Bay and Lower Machota Creek. Yeah. And the interesting thing to me is that in this will, he talks about King Copsico, which is the name of this place, yeah, where we live. And it's been known, in all my lifetime, it's been known as King Copsico Farm, and it was known as King Copsico Farm when my grandfather bought it in 1896, and then before that, it was in my relatives of my mother, ancestors of my mother. But in this will, he talks about in that neck of land called King Copsico, and he leaves out the I, but it's obviously the same, yeah, name. And but in talking about the neck of land, I gather he's talking about the entire area, yeah, between Nominee Bay and Lower Machota Creek was called King Copsico at the time. Yeah. And then as it got split up, it took on different names. Mm-hmm. But this, where we're sitting, retained the original name of the entire neck. Mm-hmm. Cabin Point was a part of it, and the part over where Albany Farm, where Lloyd Griffith lives, was part of this. larger tract. And I have always understood that it's that part of that where Lloyd Griffith now lives, called Albany Farm now. But I'd always heard as a child that Albany was originally known as Secretary's Point or Spencer's Point. And the local folklore is that Nicholas Spencer, that's where he lived. That he lived somewhere over on what is now Albany Farm. But nobody's ever found any trace of a house or any spot there. And the Washingtons lived right across Buckner's Creek at what is now Bushfield. That was Washington property.
Okay.
So they were very close. The Washingtons and Nicholas Spencer and the Wrights were all in here, say from 1650 to 1700.
And then the other important person of Cople Parish, of course, is Mary Ball.
Yes, but Mary Ball was born in Lancaster County.
Oh, she was?
In the Ball, I think in Lancaster. Yes, she was born at Epping Forest is the name of the place. The house is not the house in which she was born. There's an old house there now, but it's not the original. But she was orphaned, and she was brought to Westmoreland County as the ward of Colonel George Eskridge, who lived at what is now called Sandy Point, and he lived in the Sandy Point area. And she was raised by the Eskridge family. Whether there was a blood relationship there or not, I don't know. And if it was, I don't know what it was. But I know that Mary Ball was raised by the Eskridges and then ultimately married George Washington's father. Okay. And they were, at the time of their marriage, Washington's father was living up at what is now, Pope's Creek Plantation, or Washington's birthplace, it's now called. Mm-hmm. In those days, it was called Pope's Creek Plantation. And he mentioned, Spencer mentions Pope's Creek in his will.
And so Mount Vernon came to George through inheritance.
Yes. And how the Washingtons got the Spencer interest, I don't know. Because apparently a Washington and Nicholas Spencer bought what is now Mount Vernon together. And somehow later on the Washingtons acquired the Spencer's interest.
Yeah.
The fact that Cople Parish is named for Cople Parish in Bedfordshire, it clearly indicates that it was the influence of Nicholas Spencer.
Oh yes. I think there's no doubt on that.
There was no doubt and there's no doubt that once he was here, he was a very important figure.
Yeah.
Because he was in the House of Burgesses, he was a justice, he was everything. He had all the offices, plus he served for a short time as interim governor. So he was obviously a man of tremendous importance, both politically and financially, because with all this land that apparently he had purchased. But whatever happened to him, I don't know. Do you have any idea? Have you ever found any record of, other than the fact that he died? But I don't.
I was wondering whether he would have indicated in his will where he wanted to be buried, because in some occasions somebody of that importance would possibly have wanted to be taken home, but I haven't found any reference at all on that.
I would assume that he would have been buried, as most people of his class and status were, at the home place, wherever he was living. And I rather doubt that he would have gone back to England, since his wife was a Virginian, and two of his sons at least were here. So I would assume there's been speculation for years that he's buried somewhere over on Albany Farm. But nobody knows. Well, according to this, the will was in 1688, and I've seen two references. One that says he died a few months later in 1688. I saw another reference to the fact that his death was in 1689. But in either event, he died fairly soon after signing this will, which was it was dated April 25th, 1688. Cople Parish has been historically a very important parish within the Diocese of Virginia. Actually, when Bishop Goodwin was here, from 1917 to 1930, he was rector not only of Cople Parish, but he was also rector of Lunenburg Parish, which is St. John's Church, Warsaw, and North Farnham Parish. When he came, there was a little church at Emmerton called Emmanuel Church in Richmond County that was built in the 19th century. It was one of those board and batten, looked like St. Stephen's down in Heathville. And then while Bishop Goodwin was rector, he oversaw and raised the funds to get North Farnham restored, which had been heavily damaged. And when North Farnham Church was restored and reopened for worship, Emmanuel was deconsecrated and ultimately torn down. But Bishop Goodwin had all three of these parishes. And all three of them had a very strong ties to the diocese. Bishop Henry St. George Tucker, who was presiding bishop of the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States, was born in Warsaw. His father was rector of Lunenburg. He was rector here too. And he was, I'm not sure whether Bishop Tucker's father, whose name was Beverly, was rector of Cople Parish as well as North Farnham and Lunenburg, but he may have been. But in any event, he lived in Warsaw. So did Bishop Goodwin live in Warsaw. That's where the rectory was in those days. And Bishop Tucker's father was rector in Warsaw, lived in Warsaw, and that's where Bishop Tucker was born. Well, a lot of very influential people were there. Richard Lee II, the scholar, in the 17th century, and people like Nicholas Spencer, and they were, and then later Robert Carter, and they were Washingtons and the Lees. They were very prominent and very important people in the colony, and so obviously their home area became very important. And so when Bishop Goodwin died and was buried at Yokomoka, Bishop Lee was here, and I spoke to him and said, "Thank you so much for coming." He says, "Well, could you not come to Cople Parish? It's the Westminster Abbey of the Diocese of Virginia." I'll never forget. He said, "Cannot come. You have to never give up a chance to come to Cople Parish. It's the Westminster Abbey of the Diocese of Virginia." And in a way, I guess it really is. It's got a lot of history.
Cople Parish got its name from the fact that one of its earliest leaders was Sir Nicholas Spencer, whose home in England, his home church was Cople Church near Bedfordshire, England. And that's where the name Cople came from. We were founded in 1664, May the 25th, 1664. Westmoreland County actually established Cople Parish. And in those days, the parish was the established church of England. And no other churches were allowed in the colony of Virginia. It was simply the Church of England, and therefore the vestry of the parish took on a lot of the responsibilities that today's Board of Supervisors would take on, and that would include taking care of the poor and the sick and trying to build whatever roads they had. And people were required in that colonial period to come to church. Church attendance was mandatory and tithing was mandatory. I think church attendance was mandatory because it was the one way that you could check up on people's condition. If they didn't show up for church, you could go to their house and see if they were okay. Through the late 1600s, Yokomoka Church, which was built in 1655 before it became a part of Cople Parish, and Nominee Church, which had a church on the other side of the Nominee Creek from where it is today. Both of them were fairly small chapels, and they existed through the end of the 1600s as part of Cople Parish, and those two churches, even though they're different buildings today, are still part of Cople Parish. And the parish is defined, the boundaries, is the Nominee Creek on the east end and the Yokomoco River on the west end. And those boundaries are still in effect 350 years later. But in 1704, Nominee Church moved its location from the west side of Nominee Creek to the east side of Nominee Creek on this same property where we're sitting today. So 1704, Nominee Church had its second church, and in 1706, Yokomoco had its second church. Now the interesting thing is that they both served throughout the period of the established church. And when the revolution occurred and ended successfully in favor of those that were leading the revolution, the established church was disestablished. And people that had been members of the established church decided they didn't want to be a member of a church that was a symbol of the king. So both Nominee Church and Yokomoco Church went for a period of a number of years, from about 1780 until the War of 1812, where they weren't used. And a number of those colonial churches during that time period actually fell into such disuse that they were torn down, and many of them we lost. We did lose that second 1704 Nominee Church on July the 20th, 1814, when the British had an invasion up the Nominee River, Nominee Creek, and burned that 1704 church to the ground. They came up Nominee Creek primarily, as they did throughout the Northern Neck, primarily in search of provisions. And they got all the grain and cattle and dairy products that they could get. And perhaps it was the work of a single Admiral Coburn who actually gave the command to burn the church. And it may have been an obsession, personal obsession with him to burn everything he could burn. In fact, he got the nickname Admiral Arson, and also, since his name was Coburn, he got the name Admiral Goburn. So I don't know that it was, because it was the only church that was burned. Of course, they went through Kinsale, which didn't have a church in the village of Kinsale, and burned Kinsale pretty much. And they burned Bushfield and the home of George Washington's brother.
What about the archaeological excavations that have taken place here?
Well, the archaeological excavations that have taken place here were done in the 1990s by a professor and a team of his students from Longwood University. And they determined that the evidence of the brickwork that they found submerged by that time, that it had been burned, that it had not just simply been bombarded and then in later years fell to the ground. It was, from what they could tell, it was burned. And the walls of the 1704 church are not included in this current 1849 church. Would have been slightly to the east of here, and they would have faced east and west, This church is facing north and south. And in a colonial church, colonial churches were built facing east and west, with the altar in the east. Ironically, the 1706 Yokomoco Church was saved by the War of 1812 when a company of American soldiers from New Jersey went to Yokomoco Church in search of a place to hang their hats. And one of those soldiers was so taken by the colonial church and what it had meant to the founding of the country that he was determined to save it and to restore it. And he consequently came back after the end of the War of 1812 and spent a number of years over a period of time as he could do it to restore that 1706 church. And by 1834, Yokomoco Church had a full-time Episcopal rector, but from basically 1780, it had no clergy. Now, Nominee Church, which had been burned to the ground in 1814, was rebuilt in about 1848, and this is the church that we're sitting in today. In 1890s, the little village of Tidwells on the lower Machoda Creek, we got the Yokomoco River, the Nominee Creek, and now we're introducing the lower Machoda Creek. And this little community didn't have a church. In the 1890s, you were a waterman, and you very seldom left that community. So they built a church in the 1890s. It became an ecumenical church. But it was served by the Episcopal and Methodist clergy. And finally, in 1924, that little church in Tidwells, which had had a variety of names, became St. James Church and was officially became part of Cople Parish. So those three churches, Yokomoco Church as it stands today, built in 1706, Nominee Church as it stands today, built in the late 1840s, and St. James Church at Tidwells, built in the 1890s, are still all three used churches in Cople Parish. The cemetery, I'll start at St. James at Tidwells. That cemetery is obviously not as old, and I think the earliest burials there would date to the early 1900s. But that cemetery was established, although we maintain it, it was established as a community cemetery. So anybody that lives in the Tidwells community can buy a cemetery plot there at St. James. Yokomoco Cemetery, they're actually two different spaces. One is what we call inside the wall, and that would date to the colonial period. And because of the period of time when the church was not used, most of the records pertaining to those that were buried inside the wall in the colonial period were lost, and the grave markers were lost, and so those are unknown remains. I like to characterize them as known only to God. Outside the wall, is the way we describe it, is the active cemetery, and its earliest burials started occurring in the 1880s, thereabout. There are a few grave markers that indicate a death date that may have been in the 1820s, but I think those are largely memorial markers, and there are no actual remains there, but they're memorial markers. And we have about 750 interments at Yokomoco Cemetery. including Bishop Frederick Dean Goodwin, who was rector of Cople Parish and then later Bishop of Virginia. And we also have the noted author John Dos Passos, who was buried there in 1970. And we also have a columbarium where ashes can be placed into a compartment. Interestingly, Mary Ball, who was born in Lancaster County and later became the mother of George Washington, lost both of her parents when she was in her early teens, and became, her guardian became George Eskridge, who lived at Sandy Point, which is not too far from Yokomico. So it's clear that Mary Ball, as a youngster in her early to mid-teens, would have attended Yokomico on a regular basis. There is no record of George Washington, her son's baptism. And so there have been some that have thought that he was baptized at Yokomico Church, but we don't have any official record of that. But it was interesting that at our service where the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, I'm talking about the presiding bishop of the entire church, 17 countries, 7,000 parishes, said in her sermon that this was the church where George Washington was baptized. So the presiding bishop thinks, we think it must be right. But there's no, we do know that he came to this church. So I mean, it would not have been this same physical church. It would have been the predecessor church. His brother lived right up the road from here at Bushfield, and his nephew, who became a longtime member of the United States Supreme Court, appointed by John Adams, lived right up the road. So the Washingtons were certainly in this neighborhood frequently. The Lee family is very much associated with Cople Parish. Thomas Lee, who was the builder of Stratford Hall, along with his wife, Hannah, had two sons plus 6 other children, but 2 of their sons, Richard Henry Lee and Francis Lightfoot Lee, signed the Declaration of Independence. Richard Henry Lee and his father Thomas were both members of the Vestry of Cople Parish. Francis Lightfoot, who spent his adulthood in Richmond County, would have been a member of Lunenburg Parish, but clearly the early Lee family leaders, in addition to the ones, Richard Henry and his father Thomas, there were many other Lee family that were involved. Well, I would make a further comment about Frederick Dean Goodwin, who came to Cople Parish directly out of seminary in 1917 and served as rector of Cople Parish from 1917 to 1930. And he served several other churches in addition to the 3 that were in Cople Parish. He then went directly from this rural area to become the assistant bishop, and within a short period of time became the Bishop of Virginia and served for some 30 years as bishop. And I think a lot of people that have studied the history of the Diocese of Virginia would think of Bishop Goodwin as the icon. And one of the more interesting occurrences in recent years was that we had the good fortune of having his granddaughter as our rector. And she had grown up in the other parts of Virginia, but had spent a lot of time in the Northern Neck and in this Cople Parish as a child. And to have her come back as a rector, and she was the first female rector we had, and was succeeded by our current priest, Ellen White, so we've had 2 females in a row. And I think everybody has been delighted with the fact that women can now serve in any capacity in the Episcopal Church. Well, it's interestingly that Reverend Khaki Swan, who was Bishop Goodwin's granddaughter, said that when she was a child, the only thing she could do was sing in the choir. She couldn't even be an acolyte, which, and that's not that many years ago. I mean, 40 years ago, maybe. So we've come a long way.
Thank you for watching our brief program on Cople Parish in its 350th year. We also invite you to enjoy our other presentations related to our anniversary, including Dr. Chris Agnew's outstanding 4-part series on the history of the colonial church, and the videos of the reception for the presiding bishop, as well as the May 25th commemoration service.